Good morning, everybody. Michael here, and I have decided today to do session 7, the final session of the series on the birth narratives that I've been giving in the classroom here on my public page. So you can see the final episode. We've already done 6 sessions. We've looked at Matthew's birth narratives, issues around the virgin birth, Luke, the Gospel of Luke, sources behind the birth narratives, the theological trajectories of the biblical writers on these birth narratives. And so I'm going to do some summary work here on the Gospel of Luke to conclude all of the exegetical work and theological work that we did in the first 6 sessions. So welcome everybody to the last session. I will be referencing an awful lot from the previous 6 sessions. Okay, let me just tell you some things that we did discuss that inform my reading of this birth narrative. First, we discussed at one point the synoptic problem and the fact that we have 2 birth narratives that are quite distinct, and asking about if one was correcting the other. Is there a borrowing of either Luke or Matthew from the other? We talked about, of course, Markan priority and 2-source thinking, 4-source, what's known as either the 2-source or the 2 gospel hypotheses. We also looked at James Edwards' work in and around the Gospel of Hebrews, and that Luke, in fact, uses the Gospel of Hebrews as a major source, and that can be traced through the use of anti-Semitisms. Anti-Semitisms, oh my gosh, from the use of Semitisms in the Greek text. That is, Greek, the words are Greek, but the syntax is Semitic or Hebrew or Aramaic. So we looked at Edwards' particular work, talked about the possibility that we're dealing here with 2 Jewish Christian birth narratives. That is, Matthew's birth narrative and the Gospel to the Hebrews. So Luke's birth narrative is not created out of whole cloth by the author of Luke. And the fact is, you can see from the first 4 verses, which are quite excellent Greek, an immediate shift in verse 5 to a translation loaded with Semitisms. So we talked about these 2 birth narratives in Jewish Christianity and why it is in Jewish Christianity that the virgin birth was raised. Now, please understand this. The virgin birth does not arise out of Gentile Christianity. It's not a later dogma or doctrine. And so many of our progressive Christian friends absolutely fail at this point because they read into the virgin birth text Greek philosophical ideas. I just read a blog recently by a fellow that authored a book on the virgin birth. Evidently, it has to be a good book. Fortress Press published it. But one of his arguments is that the virgin birth detracts from the humanity of Jesus, and that's too bad. He looks at it that way. Hans von Kampenhausen many years ago had demonstrated when you look at the virgin birth in the early church fathers, they use it to emphasize Jesus' humanity. So, you know, there are ways of reading the fathers that are better than others, and we're going to follow von Kampenhausen's reading there. The virgin birth is not a text that, a story rather, that is used to emphasize Jesus' divinity in the early church, but his humanity. That should also be seen as the case, I think, in Jewish Christianity. And we could discuss this in some detail at some other point, but we are not dealing here with Platonic notions, okay? So both these birth narratives will arise from within Jewish Christianity to tie Jesus very, very closely into the Jewish story. And this is really key here, because as we saw, one of the other things we discussed was the role of the Baptist, the way Luke intertwines the narratives of Jesus and John the Baptist's birth so that they literally parallel each other. Each scene is paralleled by a scene from one to the other. And John the Baptist's role is significant not only in early Christianity, but we noted in the introduction to all 4 Gospels. And the way the writers approach John the Baptist is going to be slightly different in each case. But in all cases, no matter how you slice it or dice it, John the Baptist plays a looming role in the emerging way the story of Jesus was being told in the second half of the first century, and probably in the first half as well. And we discussed the role of the Baptist, and one of the things that we saw was that the Baptist was your, in a sense, prototypical Second Temple eschatological preacher of judgment and light of the coming kingdom of God. And that included a serious day of recompense that would follow that judgment. And we discussed that in Samaritan literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, apocalyptic literature, and elsewhere. Now, when we come to Luke, we note that the gospel is juxtaposed within the context of the temple. It begins with a story in the temple and it ends with a story in the temple. And the book of Acts opens with a story in the temple, but it doesn't end there. It ends in Rome. The gospel is framed by the temple. And I've done other talks about the importance of the temple in the gospel tradition and in the New Testament. But Luke's framing of this within this context of the temple should significantly highlight for you the role of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in the development of the Jesus narrative. So Jesus is tied very intimately now in, as cousins, as it were, with the priestly tradition through John the Baptist and Zechariah. Note 3 times in this text when an angel appears, the first words, or close to the first words, are, "Do not be afraid." To Zechariah, he says, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah." To Mary, he says, "Do not be afraid, Mary." And to the shepherds, he says, "Do not be afraid, for see, I bring you good news of great joy." If this text is about anything, it's about the announcement that the birth of this child does not create fear. Now, I'm going to ask you to hang on to this insight, because we're going to go look at the 2 significant songs, Mary's Magnificat and the Song of Zechariah. And we're going to notice that in both these songs, there is a Second Temple eschatological theme running through it that is going to include a day of recompense and judgment. This is very important because we're juxtaposing here a message that on the one hand is good news of great joy, as we'll see later, for all the people, and then a little later for all the Gentiles. Even so, we have to ask about what's happening in these hymns and the expectation that's occurring. So let's look at Mary's Magnificat. I'm simply going to breeze through the first part, and I'm going to focus on a particular set of verses. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior. He has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. There's the Phobos. That's just classic awe and fear before the Almighty that we find in religion. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has remembered his servant Israel, in remembrance of his mercy according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and his descendants forever. Note, there is an economy of exchange in this hymn. That economy of exchange says, if you've got power, you are now going to be powerless. Excuse me, I'll turn that off, thank you. I meant to turn the volume down on my phone earlier and I didn't. This text says, if you're rich, you will be sent away as poor. There's an economy of exchange here. We call it justice, okay? And we have this Second Temple view of justice, where in the end, everything is going to get switched around. And if you had bad things happen in this life and the next one good things happen, we see it in Luke in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, don't we, in Luke 16? This same logic. What Jesus is doing there with that parable is fascinating. Now, we see this same Second Temple Jewish theme in Zechariah's song, where he says of this particular Savior that's been raised up for the house of David, that fulfills the promise to the ancestors and the oath that was sworn to Abraham. Now, we're getting this major fulfillment theme here, to grant us that we, being rescued from the hands of our enemies. And all I'm going to ask you to do is think about how this is done in Second Temple literature. It's done with a mighty apocalyptic, serious bloodbath like we see in the book of Revelation. We see it in the Holy War in Qumran. So that we might serve him without fear, in holiness and in righteousness. Both these texts expected judgment. Both these texts are looking forward to this time, and we see this in the prophets. Listen, it's there in the prophets. It's there in Second Temple literature. It's part of this worldview that in the end, when God rescues Israel, God is going to reverse everything. There's going to be a major economy of exchange. Here's the thing. As you move through the birth narrative now, and you come to the announcement of the angel in chapter 2 to the shepherds, he says, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David," yada, yada. All the people, Israel. But just a scant bit later in the text, there is another hymn, another song by Simeon, who recognizes that he has now seen the salvation which you prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles. And there it is. There's the switch. Bam! The narrative switches entirely. We have been expecting, throughout the announcement of this birth process, these narratives, we've been expecting some kind of major reversal, some kind of Second Temple economy of exchange eschatology, where if you did bad things in this life, bad things were done to you in the next, and if you did good things in this life, good things were done to you in the next, and if you were poor and humble and lowly and oppressed and beat down in this life, why, you would get to be the oppressor in the next one. Except that God's the oppressor and hell is the place where all your enemies are oppressed. Do you see the problem here with all of this kind of thinking? You see it reflected, by the way, in the book of Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace. I don't know if Volf has changed his mind, but at least in that book, the argument of the book is we can be nonviolent now because we believe God gets to bring violence at the end of time. It becomes absolutely significant to work all elements of Christian theology through the lens of understanding the relationship of violence and the sacred, and removing violence from every bit of it. That's what the gospel is doing. That's what this text is doing. It's on a movement away from that, so much so that even as we move through the narrative of John the Baptist and his Second Temple thinking in Luke 3, then we have Jesus' narrative in Luke 4 in his first sermon that almost gets him killed when he says God has taken Jubilee to the Gentiles. And then, of course, we have the famous break with John the Baptist in chapter 7. John isn't sure if Jesus is the one to come because there's not a whole lot of revolution going on. So when we preach these birth narratives, if we're going to be faithful to where the writer is going in these narratives, the reality is these narratives are inclusive. And this judgment theme that we see promised here, as it says in the Magnificat, he has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. Does that happen in the gospel? Does Herod get toppled, or Pilate, or Caiaphas? No, we don't see that. We haven't seen the The mighty toppled since then. The mighty have always been the mighty. They topple themselves sometimes, or they get toppled now in revolutions, but they're all violent. We haven't seen any toppling, have we? Not in Luke, and not in the book of Acts. And unless you're willing to make the call that at the end of time, even after the gospel's all about grace, that at the end of time somehow there's an economy of exchange, and grace is dispensed with. The fact is, the way we think about eschatological justice is being challenged right here in these birth narratives. There is no fear here. Don't be afraid, Mary. Don't be afraid, Zechariah. Don't be afraid, shepherds. Don't be afraid, Zacchaeus, rich tax collector. Don't be afraid. You see? Our problem, again, is that we only have two lenses that we can read the Bible through as modern Protestants. We're either reading it through the evangelical lens of the oppressor or the progressive liberal lens of the oppressed. We're either seeing victims as truly guilty and we cover them up with myth, or we see victims as often either innocent or random, but crying out for justice. But we don't make the move that the gospel makes. The gospel makes a different move. The move the gospel makes is to the forgiving victim. That's the way out. This text is trying to show us that. It moves from the core of the temple, the Holy of Holies, all the way to the known world, the Gentiles. And it continues on through the book of Acts. Again, temple at the beginning, Rome at the end. Both books do the same thing, same move. The birth narratives cannot be used to browbeat anybody. They're good news for everybody. God has come to us in the flesh. Yes, we abused him. Every single gospel writer deals with the rejection of Jesus and his message. It's a major theme in the New Testament, the rejection of Jesus. We see it in Paul, Romans 9 through 11. We see it actually in a number of places in Paul's writings, but we certainly see it in the gospel tradition. And I would say that the gospel has largely been rejected by Protestant Christianity of all stripes, because it has only ever managed to speak with one of two voices, the voice of the victim of myth or the voice of the victim in travail. It has not yet made the move to perceive and understand that all Christian theological thinking is done precisely by recognizing that Jesus has separated violence and the sacred forever. There is no such thing as divine violence or economies of exchange. They're all in our heads. God is simply good. What God does is good for us, and what God has done is good for us. And what God has done is reveal the way out. That's what this text is all about. It's a revelatory text of what the prophet like Moses looks like as he journeys from Galilee to Jerusalem to die, knowing his fate has been sealed when the people would make him king. They wanted a politician. They wanted a political leader. They wanted somebody that would hold the megaphone in front of the crowds. They wanted somebody that was charismatic enough to make things happen. And Jesus knew when they perceived him that way, they had sealed his doom. That's Luke's gospel. That's how Luke sees things. Now, just for a moment, I want to reflect on the virgin birth. The virgin birth creates conundrums for anybody that is willing to acknowledge the way human procreation normally works. It is also true that there are in nature certain species that are able to reproduce sexually, known as parthenogenesis. Is a literal reading of the virgin birth essential for the Christian faith? That is, must one affirm the physical virginity of Mary as part of the Christian faith? There's the question. My first response is this. It was evidently not significant enough to warrant a place theologically in the developing narrative of Jesus prior to 70 CE. Second, there was some sort of need perceived by both the writer of the Hebrew Gospel, from which Luke derives his birth narratives, and the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, another Jewish Christian gospel, to include these birth narratives and to explicitly rely on the Septuagintal text of Parthenos, young woman Alma, translated as Parthenos in the Septuagint, virgin. I am going to straddle the fence on this. Personally, I'm going to say that I think I understand the rationale behind the inclusion of the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. I'm also going to say that there is a fair amount of theological impulse in these texts that can be missed if the focus is on Mary's hymen. What I would like to say then is that these texts would, and I asserted this earlier, would have the same function in the fathers that they had in Jewish Christianity, and that's to demonstrate Jesus' humanness, his humanity, his essential humanity. He's born of a woman, as Paul says. As a Roman Catholic, I grew up Roman Catholic, I should say. I don't know that I am one, but no, I'm too Protestant for that. As grew up Roman Catholic, I would say that it's certainly possible to affirm a virgin birth. With God, all things are possible. We certainly live in a quantum universe. Would it be unusual? Yeah. Out of the ordinary? Yeah. Possible? It's always possible. Things are always possible. Who's to say what's not possible except for an empiricist? So I straddle the fence. I also want to recognize that the social status of Jesus as a bastard child might play a role in the formation of these narratives. I think that there's enough evidence in books, Jane Schauberg's book, and I've referenced a number of others in the Jesus-Driven Life, that there was a story, we'll just use the term story, passed around about either Mary or Jesus, that Jesus was illegitimate. And there's a question of whether or not we are dealing with a possible rape of Mary, and then Joseph's, being the righteous guy, takes Mary as his wife and raises Jesus. And if that's kind of being covered up by the concept of Mary's virginity, these things are possible. I think that there is a certain amount of evidence in the Gospels that Jesus, being perceived as a mamzer or a bastard child, a child whose paternity was questionable, it's there. It affects his life. You see that in the Gospel of John. There's the Pharisees who say to him that we're not illegitimate children. The implication is you are. I don't know historically about these things. What I know is this. These narratives, the focus of the narratives is on the humanness of Jesus, God delivering humanity by coming in the flesh for all people and removing fear. So if you use these birth narratives to beat people over the head instead of inviting your enemy other, why don't you try that sometime? Use the birth narratives, think of the kind of people you don't like, and invite them into that. Invite them. Recognize that the birth is for them as well. And it's hard. It's really hard to do. Because it's easy just to say the birth is for all the people, rather than all the peoples. But that's the trajectory of Luke. All right, I will leave off here. That will conclude our last session on the birth narratives. And if you want the first 6, you can join the classroom. Cheers.